من حزائن. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a very good evening to everyone. How's everyone doing today? Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yes, good evening.
Coming online. Okay, good. Okay, so let's just take another minute to get settled before we start. Okay, so let's go with Puja Blast. We have tonight, we are moving to a new topic tonight. So we concluded our discussion last week on the paradigms, the 5 approaches to qualitative research. So tonight we will begin our segment of the course on data collection, data gathering. Okay, so week 5, as you see there, the topic for tonight is issues in data gathering. So just to start with some housekeeping issues, problem statements were due today, so I just downloaded them before the class. So thank you for submitting those. I will try to give comments for everyone on the problem statements. Even though it's a very small assignment, just 5 points of your grade, but to me, the points are not what matters. Again, this is for your thesis, so I will try to give everyone some feedback on their problem statements in due time, inshallah. And someone asked me about the second assignment. Actually, it's the third assignment. The first assignment is the reading presentation. So second assignment is problem statement. So the third assignment is the interview critiques of the videos. So that one I have pushed back to May 18th of May because we are now a week behind. This is our week 5 for the class. And next week is, it was supposed to be due in 2 weeks, right? So next week, and then the following week is our mid-semester break. Okay, so because of the break, I've pushed it back to the 18th of May. Okay, so you have still 3 weeks to complete the interview critiques. All right, so should be no problems with that. And again, tonight, we will follow the same schedule as last week. So we will have our reading presentation to start with. We'll get right into it. I will have to cut short the student concern section of the class, the first part. But if anybody has any really burning questions, feel free to ask. It's okay. We can take one or two before we start. And then we'll jump right into our reading presentation until right about 7:15, and we'll take our break again like we did last week. And then after the break, we may need to follow up, finish up the reading presentation. I'm not sure. We'll see how the time goes. But after that, we're going to do an interview practice, in-depth interview practice session. Okay, so on Pucho Blast, I've uploaded a short sort of sample interview guide that we will use in the class. And what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to recruit 2 volunteers from the class to perform the interview in front of the rest of the group for us to have some observation and then discussion about the interview. Okay. I was thinking of actually doing it. I was actually thinking of breaking you up into groups of 2 and allowing you to go into your breakout rooms and doing the interviews, practicing them on your own. But then I realized that it's not gonna, I don't think that's gonna be as helpful because there's not gonna be anybody there to sort of observe or critique or anything like that. So I thought it would be better if we had 2 volunteers perform the interview in front of the rest of the class, and the rest of us could watch and observe, and then we could have some Q&A and discussion and feedback after the interview. So which do you prefer? Do you prefer that one, or do you prefer going into your own rooms and doing it separately? The first one, of course, you get to practice. So everybody gets to pretty much gets to practice doing the interview, but there's no one there to sort of give you any feedback. The second one, where we all watch 2 of the class members perform the interview, at least there's going to be opportunity for observation and discussion. So any preference from the group?
Second one.
Yeah, which is the second one? I forgot. I lost order because
Second one will be the one that there's a what do you call that? Perform in
volunteers.
front of the yes, the volunteers.
Okay. Shahira, are you volunteering to be one of the 2?
I don't mind. Yeah, sure thing.
Okay, great. Thank you, Shahira. Who would like to join Shahira as either the interviewer or the interviewee for the practice interview? The demonstration, I should say, the interview demonstration. Anyone?
I don't mind doing it. I can do
Masni?
that.
Okay, Masni. All right. Thank you, Masni. So we have Masni and Shahira will be our guinea pigs for the. So if you guys go on Pucho Blast, let me show you. Because you can download it now. Just have a look at the questions while we're doing the presentation, just to get started. But in the course handouts folder, I have uploaded the in-depth interview guide, class exercise. So you can download it. It's a Word file. All right. It's just 6 questions. It's not a full-length interview, but it's a good practice interview. Okay. Because tonight's lecture is going to be on interview guide development, which of course touches on also. This is the reading for tonight. Okay, so this is a paper that we wrote from UPM a few years back. I was the main author on the paper, and it's a study on how to develop an interview guide using an actual study as an example, a study that we were conducting at the time. And so, of course, it's going to touch on issues related to interviewing, but it addresses a very important issue that often gets overlooked in the literature, which is actually how to develop the interview guide. Okay, so that was one of the reasons why I chose this article. I choose this every semester. I teach this class because it's often an issue that a lot of students struggle with, and there's not a lot of guidance in the literature on how to do it. So we talk about it in this article, and then and of course it'll also relate to actually conducting interviews as well. So we'll try to touch on both tonight, both the development of the interview guide as well as the interviewing. Okay, so that's the plan for the class tonight. So who are our presenters for this evening? Are our presenters here, I hope?
Yes, doctor, I'm here.
Okay, so Wenyu, and who is do you have a partner? Oh, okay. Wu. Hi, Wu.
Wu Yuan.
Hi. Okay, so hi. So are there any questions before we start? before I let the ladies take over with the presentation, are there any questions? Anyone have a burning question that you have to ask? You just have to get off your chest, or else you cannot feel comfortable in the class? No? Nothing? Okay, well, if there isn't yet, then let's let our presenters start their presentation. Okay.
Okay,
Now,
Doctor.
let me just start by, sorry, let me just start. I just want to make it clear that, the members of the class, you're also free to comment. I comment a lot during the presentation. That's part of the sort of class presentation style, is to sort of lecture through presentation. But if you have questions as you're listening to your colleagues present, please feel free to ask them during the presentation, okay? So this is an interactive type of presentation, okay? So I just want to make that clear to the group. All right, when you can start, go ahead. I think
Okay.
you can share your screen.
Okay, proof. Proof. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. You just have to put it in,
Okay.
PowerPoint mode.
Okay. I will start. Good evening, Proof and classmate. I'm Group 5. My name is Li Wenyu. The other member named Wu Yuanyuan. It's my great honor to share with you today our thought on reading this paper. The paper shared this week titled Preliminary Investigation and the Interview Guide Development for Studying How Malaysian Farms Form their mental model of farming. In the process of sharing, Proof and the classmates are welcome to interrupt me. In any time is no problem. So I will start the first part. When reading this paper, my team member and I have a common feeling. The paper doesn't seem to be very difficult to read, but there are many knowledge points in it. So I will give a brief introduction. First, the development of interview guide is an integral aspect of process of conducting qualitative research, yet one that receives little attention in qualitative research literature. Second, this paper is about Malaysian farmers form their mental models of farming. The third is the paper details the initial processes undertaken to develop the interview guide based on preliminary data generation. Before entering the main text, our group asked 4 questions, which we think the paper needs us to think about. We can take these 4 questions to read. The first is, what is the meaning of interview guide in qualitative research? Second, can you list a few functions, or what do you think about function of the interview guide? The third is, what are the general procedure of developing an interview guide? 4 is, what makes the process of developing an interview guide tricky for the researcher?
That's a really good way of starting a reading, actually, is to start with those questions. I really like that. It's a very good way of doing it, because this will really help you to be an active reader, to read actively, to really read, seeking knowledge out of what you're reading. So that's a very good approach. Yeah, good idea.
Thank you, Proof. We will share from the following 5 parts. The first is the definition of interview guide. The development of interview guide is an integral aspect of process of conducting qualitative research, as it is through the researcher that qualitative data is generated or collected, analyzed, and interpreted. Interview guides vary from highly scripted to relatively loose, but they are all sharing certain features. It helps us to know what to ask in what sequence, how to pose your question, or how to pose follow-ups. In qualitative research, developing the interview guide is often referred to as a fairly straightforward process. Merian in 1998 refers to it as a list of questions that researcher intended to ask in an interview. Kraken in 1988 put forward 3 functions of interview guidance. The first is ensure that investigator covers all the terrain in same order for each respondent. The second is the care and scheduling for promote necessary to manufacture distance. The third is it established a channel for the direction and the scope for discourses.
So let me just stop you there. So
Okay.
yeah, so here we were referring, in the article, we're referring to the fact that there's not a lot in the literature on how to actually go about developing interview guides, even though an interview guide is usually a very important part of the qualitative research process, because even though it's not the instrument, right? What's the instrument in qualitative research? What is the research instrument in a qualitative study? You should all know this, coming from basic qualitative research.
The researcher.
Yeah, exactly, the researcher. But it's it's the researcher, however, that decides what questions to ask, and that's what the interview guide essentially is the researcher's judgment on what questions need to be asked, right? So how does the researcher go about doing that is the question that this article aimed to address. So that's hopefully what we will cover here. And as you can see there, as I showed in the literature review, there wasn't a whole lot that I had found, that we had found in the team on developing interview guides. Okay, go ahead, Wenyu.
Okay. Next part is the significance of interview guide. In this paper regarding the interview guide, there is no clear paragraph to point out the significance of research, but in many sentences, it talks about many problems and the interview guide can help us to solve. So I separated this sentence into problems and the significance. The first is, as a research team comprised 7 researchers in all. In such a large scale to study that make use of multiple researcher and sites, the interview guide become more important and consistently in data analysis. Second, without a well-structured interview guide to direct the interview with farmers, difficulties would undoubtedly arrive the time of data analysis. So in the case of team-based multi-site research, there may be a need for more detail in guide that include cues for probing to ensure some levels of consistency among the different interviewers. The third is, in an in-depth interview, it's nearly impossible to determine exactly how the respondent is going to answer, which makes probing a unique adventure with each interview. So keeping the interview on track in terms of research question is one of the challenge of doing team-based qualitative research where multiple researchers are involved in data collection.
Okay, so this is very important. So this paper is actually reporting on a study that we were conducting at the time. And the study, as you can gather from the title, is about Malaysian rice paddy farmers' mental models of farming. So we really wanted to understand how paddy farmers in Malaysia make decisions about farming. What were the influences on their decision making? So from everything from emotions to their upbringing, their education, and we really want to know how those different factors interact to sort of lead to their decision making about farming. So it's a very qualitative study, as you can imagine. And we had a team of 7 researchers, as it says there, and we were all doing interviews with farmers. And so we needed a consistent interview guide that we could all refer to. And so the challenge in qualitative research is, how do you make it consistent enough across the different researchers so that you're getting at least a fairly standardized database, of data, while at the same time allowing for things like probing and allowing for researchers to sort of follow their insights and all that, which is common to qualitative research. So that was where the tension lied, is sort of how to ensure that both of those things could be done. And so that meant developing an interview guide was a very important part of the process. So because we all had to use the same interview guide. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background of where this whole idea came from. Okay, any questions? No. Okay, when you,
Prof.
please. Oh, there's one. Again.
Maizura here, sorry, Prof. Prof,
Yeah.
it's stated here a well-structured interview guide means is a guide that was prepared, and the in-depth interview means the process, is it?
Yes. So are you familiar, Maizura, with the interview guide? What an interview guide is?
Not really, Prof. I need to do a research on that.
Well, you don't need to do a research on it. You just need to learn about it. No, the interview guide is the questions that we ask in our interviews. When we do in-depth interviews, it's that set of questions that we ask. So how do we determine what those questions are? Okay, so we don't use like quantitative studies. We don't use questionnaires, right? We use something called an interview guide, which is a more of a loose set of questions, depending on how structured it is, that we use. So the question is, and what this paper is trying to address is, how do we decide how to come up with that question, that interview guide? How do we develop it? Okay.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Maizura. When you, please.
Thank you, Prof.
Okay, thank you. Next, I will focus on the challenges of interview guide. In this paper, the first challenge is about the nature of mental model research itself. A mental model for a particular domain includes related values and beliefs. It includes conceptions of knowledge and skills, and how to use them. Mental model create perspectives and a point of view. They serves as both filter and a guide for information, learning experience, and problem solving. Often mental models overlap. The second is it was difficult to delineate between mental model of farming and their mental model of family. The third is choices about questions and probe that researchers should employ become imperative. The researcher must, through his or her deep understanding of the topic, be able to pose questions that will allow both the researchers and the respondent to explore the topic together. This process is unique to qualitative research and is often referred to as data generation, in some cases, even making data.
Okay.
Okay, the fourth is this process is particularly tricky for the researcher. They must guide the process and know what to look for in relation to research question for data not being explicit. For example, the respondent will most certainly not talk directly about mental models or even values and beliefs, yet the researcher must know how and when he or she obtain data relevant to this topic. The last is a team-based approach makes the process more complex.
Okay, so a few things there. I saw in the chat box someone mentioned about interview protocol. So yes, this is another example of being aware of jargon in qualitative research. So sometimes it's referred to as an interview guide, sometimes it's referred to an interview protocol. Okay, so it's pretty much the same thing. Just be aware of that. All right, I use the term interview guide, but you'll also come across that other term, interview protocol. The other thing here is what's very interesting, and this pertains to a lot of qualitative research studies, is the fact that like in our study, mental models are very they're hard to put in. A lot of the data is very hard to, you have to transfer things like values into concrete behaviors and actions. It's very difficult sometimes to get people like, for example, in our study, paddy farmers who are, they're used to doing work that is very tangible and concrete, and they're not used to using theoretical conceptual ideas and concepts. So you can't ask them like, what are your values as a farmer? Stuff like that. It just won't resonate with them. They won't know how to answer those kind of questions. So you have to be able to transfer topics and things like values and beliefs into very kind of concrete questions that people can answer. And so that was one of the real challenges that we faced, was how to do that. Okay. And in fact, in the beginning, after our preliminary interviews, also known as pilot tests, okay, but we don't call them really referred to as pilot tests. Maybe you can refer to them as pilot interviews, but we learned from our preliminary interviews, I prefer to call them preliminary interviews rather than pilot interviews, that we needed to ask questions in a different manner, because the farmers, they couldn't really grasp some of the questions that we were asking. Yeah, they were a little too theoretical, a little too conceptual. And I've had several students face this problem. When they go into the field, they are too stuck in their literature views, and they're asking people, sort of everyday people, about questions that using very academic terminologies and so forth, and they're not getting good data because of that. The respondents can't really answer their questions, and they get confused and they don't know what's wrong. So you have to always remember, you have to put yourself in the place of your respondents, okay? And of course, that's why you try out your interview guide, you practice the interview guide, you do your preliminary interviews, do all that work first, okay? So an interview guide, like a survey questionnaire, needs to be pilot tested, okay? Not in the same way, but it needs to be pilot tested, all right? So that's really important. Okay, any questions? Maizura, you're smiling like you have a question. Like, you don't want to ask.
Oh my God. Okay. Yeah, Prof, I just want to ask, for pilot interview for quantitative research,
Yeah.
we are not allowed to use the respondent again.
Yeah.
Okay.
True,
For
true.
quali, does it apply? Can we recycle our respondent again when we do our preliminary interview?
Don't call your respondents recycled. Okay, that's not very nice. Actually, in qualitative research, you'll find different schools of thought on that. If you get people that are more influenced by the quantitative view of things, they'll say, no, you have to use different respondents. But I was taught, and I know many scholars that say it's perfectly acceptable. You don't use them again. What you do is whatever data that you got from the preliminary interviews that's relevant to your research questions, you can use that data. Okay, so it's just a matter of whether the data is relevant, because sometimes your pilot interviews, we'll call them that just for convenience sake, call them pilot interviews. Sometimes the questions that you ask in the pilot interviews you find are not really that relevant to the study. So you won't use that data because it's not really generating much. But if you're asking good questions that are generating good data in the pilot interviews, you can certainly use that data in the main study. There's no problem with that. And then later, like after you've revised the interview guide, and then if you want to go back and ask them those revised questions, you can do that as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof.
Sure. Maizura, was there another question? I thought somebody else. No. Okay. Well, let when you continue.
Okay. The first part is research background. Regarding the research team, since the research is a team composed of many members and is not a team that specialized in farmer mental model, it becomes difficult to break the barriers between disciplines and ensure the occurrence and the consistency of data. So research team is introduced in detail in this paper. The first is this team have passion and interest for extension. Extension education became downgrade and drew less support for the government. And then the government gives some promote Malaysian government attempt to rescue the extension education has breathed new life into extension-related research. And next, the importance of current research. Research team felt that the qualitative research using mental model framework would be the most appropriate place to begin to understand this phenomenon from a more scientific perspective. And the government also gives some funding as a Malaysian government sponsored research initiative under the Ministry of Science and Technology. So this is the introduction of the team background.
Okay, so sorry, this is a really important part of this qualitative research process. Does anybody know what this part of a study is called? Where you introduce yourself as the researcher in the study?
Yes.
Yes, Prof.
What is it called? Anyone know?
Adnan?
Sorry?
It's called, I mean, you have to self-reflexive. I mean, you have to provide your reflexibility on the topic that you are going to,
okay, right.
to study.
Okay. Anyone else?
So you need, yeah, so you need to, I mean, what we call that, specify your biases, and later on you need also to bracket all these biases and set aside from the, from your, what we call from your own impression, from your own opinions of experience about the topic that you are going to research.
Well, bracketing and setting aside your pre-existing assumptions and biases, that's referred to as reflexivity, and that occurs throughout the study. That's not the actual statement here, though. I mean, of course, you will, in this particular statement, you will mention, yes, you will mention those potential biases and so forth.
Is this about positionality?
Yes. I don't know who said that, but thank you, whoever said that. I couldn't see your name on the screen.
Chai-Ing, yeah.
Oh, yes, thank you, Jane. So yeah, this is a positionality statement, basically, where you are stating your background, your relationship, particularly your relationship to the topic of the study, and your relationship to the participants of the study. Okay, so we will be looking at positionality statements a little bit closer in the coming weeks. And in fact, one of your short assignments is for you to write a positionality statement, a very short positionality statement in relation to your own research. Okay. So this is a very important part of qualitative research because, again, our epistemology demands us to be very close with our topic and our participants, right? So, of course, that also means that there's potential there for difficulties in separating out, like was just mentioned before, biases and so forth. So it's important for the reader to understand where you're coming from. And that's what this statement is about. Where are you coming from? Why are you studying this? What is your relationship to the study, to these people? How could that affect how you conducted the study? What did you do to guard against, the possibility of bias? All those things. That's what a positionality statement is all about. So in this article, in fact, the reviewer that from when we submitted this article, the reviewer asked us to really elaborate on our position to this study because we're a team and etc. And you're dealing with things like values and stuff like that. So yeah, so that's an example. Now, not all journal articles will expect this long of a positionality statement. In fact, most journals nowadays don't even really expect it. Some will just ask for a few sentences, unless it's a really hardcore qualitative journal, then they will probably ask for it. Okay, but in a thesis, you must have it if you're doing qualitative research. Okay, so just a note on that. Okay, any questions?
Yes, Prof. It's
Yeah.
Raju Muhammad.
Okay, Raju, yeah.
Yes, this also has to do with I'm talking about the team background, the positionality statement.
Yeah.
It also involves keeping records and diary of all the interaction as in an interview, in order not to allow your own interest or your own experience to interfere with the findings of the results.
Yeah, that's a very useful way of doing it. Of maintaining reflexivity is to constantly document the process. So, for example, after every interview, having some reflection, keeping a journal, a research journal, or there's another word for it. Researcher's logbook. It's also a researcher's logbook. And so you keep a sort of running commentary to yourself on your own experience in relation to this. So like you make note of the fact that, oh, during this interview, I felt myself getting very angry with the respondent when they said this, and then you need to think about that. Why is this person's response making you feel angry, for example? They must have touched on something that relates to your own experience with that topic. Maybe you had, a different experience than they did, or these are the things you need to really keep tabs on, because these are the things that are going to influence your data collection and your analysis. All right. So it's important to keep that some sort of log, some sort of journal where you can maintain that reflexivity as you conduct the study. All right. So yeah, it's a very good approach, very good method that Mr. Suraju just mentioned. Okay, thank you for that. All right. I think we can continue.
Okay. Next is the most important part in this article is the steps of interview guide. In this paper, we found 2 places to describe the interview guide development steps. The first place is to discuss in the literature research, which is divided into 6 steps. The first is selecting the topic, defining all the aspects of the topic, and formulating initial and open-ended question. And next is determining the kind of question and determining the logical order of the topic questions. And next is preparing the introduction and the end. And the final step is preparing the interview technical indications. And the researchers also emphasized that the interview guide can be revised on an ongoing basis to elicit more focused on response from participations, and to accommodate themes and emerging in the early stages of data analysis. And the other is in 7 steps suggested in this paper. This is the most important part of this paper. I mainly explain the first and the second step, and I will let my team members to do other explanation. The first is review the literature on farmers' mental models. Next is analyze of the settings through focus group. Next is develop preliminary conceptual framework, and develop preliminary interview guide based on conceptual framework, literature, and preliminary data. And next is text preliminary guide with farmers, and reflect on preliminary data and collection and the revised literature. The final step is analyze preliminary data and revise initial interview guide, including identifying areas and stages for further problem. The first is,
sorry. Can you just go back to that? Yeah. So from our experience in conducting this study, these are the 7 steps that we sort of arrived at from our work and from the study. And so you can see there, first is reviewing the literature on farmers' mental model. So this is I think a really good template for you to develop your own interview guides for your study. Okay, so again, it always starts with literature review, right? So literature review, review the literature on your topic that you're going to ask on. analysis of the setting through focus groups. Now, it doesn't have to be through focus groups, but you need to do some sort of preliminary work to have a sense of the setting that you're working in. Okay, so we did it formally through focus groups. Where we were doing a big team study. For you doing individual PhDs, you don't have to do that, but there should be some sort of analysis of the setting so that you know to what extent the literature that you've reviewed is relevant to the setting that you're studying. Okay, because sometimes there's a big gap between what's in the literature and the particular context of your own study. All right, and then we developed a preliminary conceptual framework of our study, and then from there the preliminary interview guide, so the initial guide, okay, and then testing the guide, reflecting on the data, okay, and then going back to the literature to get clarification on certain things, and then analyzing that data and then revising the interview guide. All right, and so that's sort of the process for fully sort of developing the interview guide. Now I'll let your team go through each of these steps in more detail. Go ahead.
Next step.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
the first step is a review of literature on farmers' mental models. Researchers began to delving into research literature on mental models, and they focus particularly on study dealing with farmers and mental modeling related to farming practice. And then those located qualitative studies on farmers' mental model now provide specific insight into the development of the interview guide. And this posed a problem for the research team for mental models related to beliefs, values, goals, and underlying process that influence decision making.
So this is a common comment I get from students all the time is, oh, doctor, there's nothing in the literature related to my particular topic. So what do I do? So what do you do? What's the answer? Like you're doing your qualitative study on, teaching efficacy of first-year teachers in rural Malaysian schools in Sarawak. There's no particular studies on that topic. What do I do? What do I do?
Maybe find some
similar topic.
Related.
Yeah.
So how do you define related? What's a related topic to it?
I look into
change
the
the
keyword.
keywords.
Okay,
Yeah, I
sorry.
look into the keyword of the paper, and then I try to search those keywords to see what other papers are related to it. The other thing I do is I look at those papers that are close, even though they're not located in Sarawak, okay? But
Yeah.
maybe the papers that are similar, I look into their references, and then I actually retrieve those references and read them as well.
Yeah, good. So broaden your context, right? Broaden your context. If it's quite likely that there probably won't be any studies on the specific context that you're studying. Okay, so from there, instead of worrying about that, broaden your context. So take the same core topic, but take it out of Sarawak, for example, and look and do a more global search to start with. Okay, and then you might want to look at other related studies among teaching in Sarawak, but maybe not necessarily on teaching efficacy, or something related to that, perhaps a broader issue related to teaching efficacy in Sarawak. Okay, so don't panic if you don't find any particular studies directly related to what you're doing. Okay, just try to first start by broadening your search. All right, thank you, Chang, for that. Next.
Okay, next is analyze of the settings through focus group. First, the team, for the sake of the question, they covered 25 officers and assistant officers and asked them to identify one successful, one moderately successful, and one large farmer with whom they work. And then questions were then posed to them, including descriptive, such as location, age, community or group and the group level of family involvement or in farming and others. Then from the result of the officer, tables were generated to obtain a profile of identified farmers according to the 3 levels along. Addition tables listing response to questions related to their values and worldviews. Another table was generated including officer response to the questions related to SWOT analysis.
So yeah, so this helped us really to get a good sense of what the sort of the core issues the farmers were dealing with, getting to know the farmers. So it was also building rapport with the farmers. Now, in this study, these officers, the agricultural officers, what would you call these people? We learned this term last week. So we were interviewing the farmers, but to get to the farmers, we had to go through the agricultural officers. Do you remember the term?
The gatekeeper.
Yeah.
Gatekeeper.
Exactly. So the officers were the gatekeepers. So they were sort of, and they even helped us to identify and recruit farmers. Okay. So sometimes the gatekeepers they can actually really help you out. They're not necessarily always guarding the gate. Sometimes they're facilitating the study as well. Okay. So, so this initial data was used to really help us to understand the differences between high-performing farmers and those that were sort of what we call laggard farmers, those that were less productive, to get a sense of what were some of the issues and reasons why there were differences between them. And this really helped us to begin to put together our formal or our final interview guide. Okay. So those initial interviews you do, don't expect to get, the richest data, the real definitive kind of data that's going to necessarily answer your research questions right off the bat. Sometimes the initial interviews are really more for just ice breaking and to get a general sense of what's going on in your study context. Okay. Don't expect that you're going to get all, answers to your thesis or findings for your thesis in these real early interviews. Okay, so it's important to understand that. Okay, next.
Proof, this is all of my part. I will invite my group member to do the next part.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Wenyu.
Thank you, Proof.
Okay, it's my turn. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Very good evening to Prof. Latif and my dear friends. I'm going to present the rest of our article. My name is Wu Yuanyuan. I'm going to proceed with step 3, which namely develop a preliminary conceptual framework. Okay. So based on the former 2 parts, the review of literature and the focus group data, we finally come to the conceptual framework. So don't panic about my number of words. I'm not going to cover all of this, but I'm trying to make my mind clearly. Okay, sure. So here, we need to note that the role of the conceptual framework in this study, because it is different from that its role in quantitative research. And the conceptual framework interestingly because it will evolve as the research goes along. Because when you conduct your research, you will find more new data and findings, and all of this will contribute to your ongoing conceptual of the study and creating more new insights in relating to your study topic. Here, we need to pay more attention to the significance of conceptual framework, because it is an important tool for synthesizing preliminary data and the existing literature. And all of this will help us to get the research process.
So conceptual frameworks are a little different in qualitative research. We use them differently than we do in quantitative research. Okay, quantitative research, usually a conceptual framework is tested. So from your synthesis of the literature, you put together a framework that comprises the variables that you're going to study in your study and the relationships you're going to test, etc. In a qualitative study, it's an evolving kind of framework. So you can start off with an existing framework, an initial framework from your reading of literature, but then it's understood that it's going to probably evolve as you go throughout the study. Okay, so the framework that you end up with might look a little different than the one you started out with, based on what you've learned from the study. Okay, but it does provide you an initial guide, an initial sort of a picture of where you're going to go, and a sort of foundation for initially exploring your topic. And so we wanted, because we were dealing with a big literature in this study, we had all these different elements. Mental models include many different elements, and we really wanted to get a sort of something that's a bit easier, more manageable to make sense of. So we came up with this conceptual framework based on our reading of the literature, and so it was a useful step and tool for us. Okay, so they're not required though. Don't feel like in a qualitative study you have to come up with a conceptual framework. You might get a supervisor that requires you to do it. There are supervisors that require students to do it. So it depends, but it's really not necessary to do in a qualitative study.
Is it kind of similar to like a preliminary coding structure to guide us for analysis, and also to guide us in terms of how we want to ask, what we want to ask our participants? Or is it just, something we synthesize out of the research, the papers that we have read?
Yeah, it's more the
Sorry,
core concepts. It's more from the literature. It's the core concepts that you want to explore in your study. The coding structure framework is more an analytical framework, whereas that's the more specific concepts and constructs that you're going to actually analyze. Now it depends. If you're using a more deductive approach, right? You may start off with a coding structure, a sort of preliminary coding structure that would come from the literature, but not all qualitative studies are going to have that, only because that requires a deductive approach. Those of us who are doing a more inductive approach, we won't know what our initial codes are, right? So it really depends on how deductive you want to be in your analysis. And it's really up to you. It's based on your reading of the literature and the study topic and those kind of things. It is perfectly acceptable in qualitative research to start off with a pre-existing coding structure from your review of the literature. It's acceptable. A lot of people don't realize that. They think, oh no, we can't use deduction in qualitative research. We can't do that. No, you can do that. But you have to acknowledge the fact that you're doing deduction, and it's okay. Right? It's okay. Just don't be wed to those codes that you start out with. As you go through the study, you're gonna, new codes may emerge that you're gonna add to that structure. But it's okay to start off with a preliminary coding structure as well. Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, I found that in the past, what happened was that I already had my own preconceived ideas or understanding about the topic. So I had a preliminary structure, but as I went along, I had to break down this structure, and then it came out with a different structure after we analyzed. Yeah.
Great.
So,
yeah, that's a good experience to have, because that's really the process. You have to be open to the fact that you got it wrong to start with, but it's not a bad thing. That's just based on whatever information that you had to start out with, right? So it's reading of the literature, it's whatever, maybe even your own insights from experience may have played a role in that, so that's fine. But the problem is that the problem becomes when people are not willing or not able to see, emerging findings, and they cannot like you said, admit the fact that you had it wrong. That's when it becomes a problem. So again, you have to have that that mentality of the qualitative researcher, which is flexibility. You have to have that ability to be flexible. Okay, so
this is her. This is Jun speaking, and in this case, can we say that the conceptual framework is not plausible for the grounded theory research, because we, you know that for the grounded theory research, we usually do the inductive applaud the inductive approach, so we cannot do some rational. Let me see. We cannot find some theory beforehand, right?
Right. Yes, you would think so, Junji. That's more often the case. Yes, but you will, in the literature, you will come across some grounded theory studies that do start off with conceptual frameworks, theoretical frameworks, and that's because of their school of grounded theory that they're using. So if you use the more traditional classical approach, you will not have any pre-existing conceptual framework. But the later approaches to grounded theory, they do sometimes do that. Even though it sounds strange because you're supposed to be developing a new theory, but what they're doing is they're just acknowledging the fact that there is other work, there is related work to that topic, and they want to acknowledge that to start with. But then from there, they develop their sort of own theory, or they develop an extended version of that existing theory, something like that. So yeah, it does sort of sound counterintuitive to the method, and so it sort of is to some degree. But yeah, most grounded theory studies you will not find. That's true. It is a more inductive approach.
Yes, and also in the previous part that we have seen the name of let me see, the name of Strauss and Holbein, right? And it reminds me of the two forerunners of the grounded theory, that is the Glasser and Strauss. And in the very beginning, they cooperate together to create such theory, but later they have some different, even we can say the opposite opinion toward it. And nowadays we can see that there are two fashions about it, and the most common fashion is about the three procedures when we conduct the grounded theory research. That is the open coding, SIO coding, and the selective coding. But also for the process proposed by Glasser, that it is just only two procedures. One is about essential, and another one is about the theory. So could you please tell us which one is more reasonable for the present researchers when they conduct research?
Glaser's approach, the classical grounded theory approach, which is the original Glaser and Strauss approach, and then they had their sort of differences. They went their separate ways. Glaser maintains the notion that you don't use axial coding. You code, and then suddenly, eventually, your theory just emerges. That kind of study is harder to do because you don't start off with any literature review. You don't start off with any preliminary background work. It's just you go straight into the field, and they're often very rigorous studies. So that's why you see very few of those classical grounded theory studies, especially in our part of the world. So most grounded theory is according to Strauss and Corbin's approach, or Sharma's approach, which is a lot closer to sort of conventional qualitative research. But Glaser, to this day, if he's, I think he's still alive, I'm not sure, but to this day he maintains that the original classical grounded theory is the only real grounded theory. So there was a period where I was very much into that literature. I was reading very closely about the debates and the differences. So I don't want to get into it too much right now, but for students, it's easier to do the more contemporary approach. Glazer's approach is a bit more challenging for students. And in UPM, you'll have a hard time getting past your proposal defense if you use Glazer's approach because there's no literature review. So good luck trying to defend your proposal without a literature review in UPM. Yeah. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so thank you for the question. So Wan, you want to continue?
Yes. So let's look at the conceptual framework of this study. And these two tables were presented at the article. The first one, the researcher team identified prior knowledge and experience will influence the farmer's mental model. Excuse me. Will influence their mental model. It incorporates beliefs, thinking patterns, values, goals, and concepts. And all of these fundamental concepts will influence the farmer's decision making. For example, their problem solving, learning, risk taking, and all of this. And this and because this research was written, this article was written by 7 researchers. So they, let's move to the next slide. So they have their own tasks and duties. We will explain more in our step 4. Now we come to the step 4. Based on the conceptual framework, now we come to the stage of develop preliminary interview guide. And in generating the interview guide, we need to bear 2 things in mind. First one, the level of structure. And according to NASA and Macmillan and Borders, the second thing we need to bear in mind is that topics and interview questions, because all of these 2 parts are very important in the interview guide. Without 2 of these, we can't formulate a successful interview guide. And to prepare the interview guide, the first step was team members were each given a category from the conceptual framework. We have seen the table before, and they were requested to come up with 5 questions each. Eventually, the team developed an initial list of approximately 30 questions. It's very much right. And let's look at in the latter stage, which is more meaningful to me. Is I found this part is very useful to us because it has a big explanation about triangulation in this article. All of the questions were reviewed one by one and scrutinized by the other team members. They check their language relevance and probing potential. All of these questions are also regrouped because they need to make sure each of the questions was sufficient, was covered. And this progress resulted in a preliminary interview guide of 19 questions. And do you remember at the first stage, it was 30 questions, and now after the second stage, it became 19 questions.
So from here, it's going from conceptual framework to the actual interview questions. So turning those concepts into actual questions for the interviews. All right. So this is one of the advantages of having the conceptual framework is that you can then operationalize those core concepts that you've identified from your literature review and your preliminary interviews. Okay, so it's a rather systematic approach. Of course, we had the advantage of having a big team, so we could scrutinize each other's questions, which helps a lot. You guys as individual PhD students won't have that. So you have to find other ways of getting feedback on your interview guides. Okay, so most likely you'd use your supervisors, your supervisory committee members to help you to do that. Okay, next, go ahead.
Okay, Prof, I have one question.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, for language checking, is it okay to ask our colleagues, our friends to do the language checking?
For the language.
Yes.
Are you talking about like translating it from Chinese to English?
Yes.
Yeah. It's best to have somebody who you know is well versed in that language. So sometimes people even say you need this is of course for reporting in your actual report, in your study report, you know, the actual thesis. But it's always good to have somebody that has a high level of in that language so that you can make sure that it's accurate, you know, the translation is accurate. That's the important thing.
Okay, thank you, Prof.
But you'll be conducting your interviews in English or in Mandarin, or in
I think I will do Mandarin because it
Yeah.
is much easier for learners.
So then where's what translation are you referring to? You asked about translation.
Because I need to write my thesis, so the translation.
Okay, so you're talking about when you report the findings.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, reporting is different. When you do your reporting, then you need to definitely have somebody to check your translation. Definitely. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Prof.
But it's always good to do all the analysis in the language of the interview because you don't want to lose any of the meaning that comes with the actual words used by the respondents. So I always tell students just translate at the very end. So only translate that which you're going to actually use in the thesis.
Yes, but sometimes it's hard to translate from our first language to second language.
Yeah, that's why you need somebody to help you. You need somebody to check it for you. Yeah.
Okay, can I continue?
Please, go ahead.
Okay. Now we come to step 5. We have the conceptual framework and we have the initial interview guide. Now we need to test with our research samples. They are the farmers. And the participants were 7 farmers, and population. All of the interviews were arranged through the agriculture officers. We will call it AO in the later stage. And they are in 2 local districts in, I don't know how to pronounce this word. Terengganu. Thank you. Okay, and the interviews were conducted at the district AO, as well as in some cases it was conduct at the farms.
Yeah.
Because I assume it is much more convenient for farmers to have their conversation. And farmers were selected by the AOs and comprise of mix of successful, moderately successful, and larger farmers as determined by the AOs. These three characteristics we need to bear in mind. There are three how to say?
Yeah, categories of farmers. Yeah.
Yeah, And the recording will be using digital IC recorders. Actually, I don't know here what does IC refers
IC recorders are the digital audio recorders that you can buy for recording audio.
Oh,
they're little recorders. You can buy them. Nowadays, you can just use your handphones. A handphone is just as good, in my opinion, but just use your iPhone.
Yes, it's much more convenient. And the data was transcribed into Microsoft Word and then transferred into ANOVA 8, Qualitative Data Management Software. I don't know how many of you can use this software, but now now I'm not able to use it because I haven't learned more. Okay, and the 7 preliminary interviews were the time duration will be from 40 minutes to 1.5 hours. The research team was advised to include all questions from the interview guide and make notes during the interview on issues related to question relevance and effectiveness. And researchers were also advised to identify important errors and prompts for further probing.
Okay, so I think it's 7:10. I think we'll stop there for the break. And I think you maybe just another 10 or 15 minutes you can finish up, right? It's not much longer. So maybe after the break, we'll just give you another 10 or 15 minutes to finish up. I think by 8 o'clock you should be finished with the presentation, and then we can go to the next activity. Okay?
Okay, no problem.
All right, so we'll take our break now, come back around 7:45. Okay, so selamat buka puasa to everyone who's breaking their fast. So we'll see.
Selamat buka.
See you in a little bit.
Selamat berbuka, Prof.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Are you there? Was it enough time to take care of everything, I hope?
Yes, Prof.
Okay.
Yes, Prof.
Yes, Prof.
Yes, Prof.
Mr. Nazrul, you're in Pakistan, yes?
No, sir, I am from Bangladesh.
Oh, Bangladesh. Sorry, Bangladesh. So what time is it there in Bangladesh?
Bangladesh is now 5:45 p.m. only, sir.
Oh, so not yet time to break fast for you.
These are not yet time to breakfast. I mean 38 minutes later after.
I see. Okay. Okay, so let's invite where'd she go? Yuan, are you there? You can continue your presentation. There you are.
Yes,
Sorry,
I'm here.
I'm looking all over the screen. Okay.
Okay. Share.
So why don't you go ahead and finish up the
Okay. Okay. Oh, I'm going to continue. What is step 5 again? Okay, it's okay. After testing with farmers, we proceed to step 6. Is a reflection on preliminary data collection and revisit literature. This part is mainly focused on the reflection. Is a researcher team to reflect on the experiences as it is related to the interview guide questions. Because the researcher teams think it was very important to do this, and they did reflection even before the coding. And here is one question: what makes reflection so important? I made a mistake here. Please omit here. The first reason is as we all know, the quality research, the the instrument of qualitative research is actually the researchers themselves. And this demands us to continuously go back and forth between the experience in the research setting and the data and oneself. We need to understand what is really happening and to determine what role the researcher is playing in order to facilitate the data generation process. And the second reason is because qualitative research method requires us to keep up with the current findings of your own topic. So you need to revisit literature continuously. So you can always identify new findings.
So that's a common characteristic of a unique characteristic of qualitative research is the ongoing literature review. So really literature review is carried out throughout the study. So it's not like in a quantitative study, you do it early on and then you do it again during discussion. Quali, you are really constantly engaging with literature as you are conducting the study. So that's partially what this reflection process was also helping us to refine our guide as we went along. Okay, so it's important to do that. Okay, last step.
Okay, after reflection, the researcher team found it is hard in some aspects to analyze to find out the findings. So they decided to analyze preliminary data and revise initial interview guide. They did the first round of data analysis using an open coding approach. By using this approach, all the relevant data is coded so as to find many textual units as possible. And the results showed that the initial list comprised of 23 codes. And after this discussion, the results come to an expanded list of nearly 50 codes. You might notice here is more codes here from 23 to 50. And after this, the research team was able to identify errors for further probing and guide revision. So they did follow-up interviews. They used a critical incident approach, which according to Flanagan 1954. Here, in order to go deep with the farmers on how and why they make the decisions they do in terms of their agricultural practice to arrive at the unconscious beliefs, here we look more depth into critical indicate approach. It was through their probing of these activating events that the mental model and how it actually impacts the farming decisions and practice were identified. This and all of these activating events help researchers to understand many important elements of mental models, beginning with assumptions, like we discussed before, those fundamental concepts like beliefs, values, thinking patterns, and other concepts, and how these concepts evolve as a result of real life experience. Otherwise, to probe the farmers' practice based on their decisions by asking them to recall two incidents would be much easier for the farmers to talk about rather than asking them questions related to their beliefs, values, assumptions, goals, and the like that might be too abstract for them to elaborate. This point is very meaningful because it recalls me in one situation because when I did an interview, in some case, too broad question made me feel very feel very messed up. Especially, we can answer some questions like describing our own experiences, which makes the interview questions more concrete and be easier for us to answer. And here, the research team, they had two fears because they are not sure whether the assumptions could be met, particularly as to whether the farmers could recall these decisions and behaviors in such detail. And the second one is there was the possibility that farmers' experiences with successful and unsuccessful seasons could be difficult for them to elaborate on. And this will result in reducing the level of detail provided and likewise the opportunities to probe.
Okay, so this phase, what we did here was we found that given the background of the farmers and their the nature of their experiences, we felt it would be easier to tease out things like decision making by giving them real life situations to reflect on. So we use something called the critical incident approach. Has anybody ever heard of a critical incident approach before? Basically what we did was we gave the farmers a scenario, a real life scenario, and then we asked them basically how they arrived at their decisions. So this allowed us to sort of map their decision-making processes using an actual real life model. So for example, we asked them, in your best growing season, tell us what you did that season that made it so productive, right? And so then they would walk back their steps, what they did, and then as they're talking about what they did, we would probe them with different questions. Why did you do this? Why did you do that, etc. Okay, and at the same time, we also would ask them, what was your worst? Tell us about your worst growing season and what was the difference in that less productive growing season. And they'd say, oh, it was because of this. And then again, we would probe on the different decisions that they made during that season. Okay, so giving them a real life, a concrete example to reflect on really helped us to sort of map and visualize how they sort of made their decisions and what the differences were between the different groups and what kind of rationale they used to arrive at their decisions. So that was a really very useful, very effective approach. Okay, so the lesson here for you guys is when you're doing your interviews, it's always good to ask for concrete examples. Okay, so don't leave it at the level of abstraction. You know what I mean? Like you're asking them these sort of abstract concepts. Get them to really give you examples. Ask for examples, right? If they can't give you examples, you provide like this. You provide incidents for them to reflect on, etc. Okay, so because when you report your findings in chapter 4, you need to really report something that's going to be concrete. You can't report on quotes from your respondents that are sort of, they can be interpreted 15 different ways. Those aren't going to be very helpful for you in terms of supporting your findings. You need really good concrete data to support your themes or your findings or whatever. So it's really important to do that. So this worked for us in this particular study with this particular group. It'll be different in every study, of course, but a critical incident approach is one way you can go about it. So, okay, should we finish up the conclusion?
Okay, and if you look at the appendix, it it has several questions about
Yeah, in the
using
appendix.
literary statement. Okay, conclusion, the final part. All in all, this article is about the development of interview guide. It comprises a 7-step process. I'm sure you must know at this stage. So the conclusion followed by identify errors and strategies for further probing. And they are in line with the dynamic and clinical nature of qualitative data collection and analysis. And from the former part, now we get close to know how farmers think and make decisions and what influences their farming practice. And in last but not least, understanding mental models helps to identify where such factors play a role in farmers' decision making. Finally, it's important to note that the quality research process is non-linear and entails constant reflection and reforming of the study. So as a researcher, we need to always revisit the literature and rewrite our own interview guides and make all of our interview questions more concrete and more clear. That's all. Thank you. Thank you for your listening.
Okay, thank you, everyone, for the presentation. So can you just put that last slide back up? Oh, okay, never mind.
Sorry.
It's okay, never mind, it's okay. It's okay. No worries. It's okay, it's okay, never mind. Don't bother.
Sorry.
It's okay, it's okay. So, why is my screen not working? Sorry. So I think those 7 steps you can easily sort of translate or convert, the sort of basic steps there for your own study. You don't have to include all 7 steps. Like, of course, we were involved in a big study. That's a big team-based study. So, but the general steps I think you should follow, and they will help you to do your interview guide in a rigorous manner. And it'll be hopefully an effective process. So that takes us to interviewing. Now, in this class, we don't spend a lot of time on actually interviewing itself per se. I don't have it's not a separate topic for this class. So we will do some practice tonight, and hopefully some issues will be raised that will be useful for people to reflect on. But for those of you, I'm assuming, because all of you should have taken the basic qualitative research class, so you should have a basic idea of what qualitative interviewing is all about. Hopefully, at least some of you have already done qualitative interviews. And so again, it's usually where this is the forum for people to come with questions and sort of discussion about deeper issues related to interviewing. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So I would, is there anything that anybody wants to ask about the article, before we move to the next activity?
Yes. I just like to ask a bit about the
topic
guide.
All right, Chang, you go first. Chang, you go first. It's okay, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I just like to ask, because like in this week's reading, the topic guide is actually for a semi-structured kind of interview, whereas the reading we had last week when we talked about phenomenology, they use an unstructured approach to interviewing. So I'm not sure, like, whether how do you actually decide whether you want to go for a semi-structured or a structured approach? And I mean, like, I guess that the interview guide for last week's article would probably be a lot simpler because they were just reduced to just 2 questions, right?
Yeah, excellent question. So usually in most qualitative studies, the default is usually semi-structured interviewing. And even though last week's phenomenological study used a very unstructured approach, even in many phenomenological studies, they use semi-structured approaches. So one, it depends on the interviewer. How experienced are you as an interviewer, and how comfortable are you using unstructured interviewing? Because unstructured interviewing, even though it looks simple, because you only have 2 questions, it's actually much more challenging. It's much more challenging because just because they start off with 2 sort of main questions, that doesn't mean those are the only questions they ask in the interview. What they're doing is they're sort of getting the ball rolling with those main questions, and then from there they just do probing on their own based on the kind of data that they're getting in the interview. So it requires a much higher level of expertise and mastery of interviewing itself, knowing how to do good interviews. So I would never recommend a student, who's doing your first major qualitative research study to use an unstructured approach. It's very challenging, That said, there are some methods or some traditions that are more appropriate for using an unstructured approach, like phenomenology, especially depending on the topic, where you're probing people's experiences. Even narrative analysis, where you're doing storytelling, tends to be more unstructured as well. So it also depends on the tradition that you're working from. But for most of you guys, I would just strongly recommend doing semi-structured interviewing. Yeah, because that structure really helps you to make sure that you're covering all the topics you need to cover, and it gives you that basic structure. Whereas the danger in using an unstructured approach is that you can get off topic very easily. And you may miss out on important core areas that you need to cover. So unless you really know what you're doing, it's not something that I would advise. Yeah, but it's an excellent question. Junji, did you have a question?
Yes, I have 2 questions, and
Okay.
the first one is about the pilot interview.
Yeah.
Just now you suggested to doing so, but my question is, you know that the number of participants are quite various in terms of the qualitative research. So when we carried out the pilot research, after that, can we still ask the same person to be the interviewee in our formal interview?
Yeah, don't think of qualitative research having a formal pilot test. What I was referring to is you can do preliminary interviews for the purpose of ensuring that your interview guide is generating the kind of data that you need to answer your research questions. Those don't have to be treated as a separate pilot test. You just treat them as preliminary interviews. If there's relevant data, you can use that data in your study. Okay, but there may not be some of the data may not be that relevant, just because, again, you're sort of testing out the interview guide, and you may find that some of the questions are not really relevant to the research question. So, but you're certainly welcome to use that data and include them as participants. Now, if you do that, you may have to go back to them to ask follow-up questions, because once you've sort of solidified your interview guide later, there may be new questions that you didn't ask them in the beginning. So you may have to go back to them again to ask follow-up questions, which is perfectly okay. Yes, yeah.
The another one is about it's about language question. Just now, Yuan Yuan has said that as the international students, most of them will usually carry out their research at their country. So when we interviewed our participants, we will use a different language, such as Chinese. But after that, we need to demonstrate them in English. So how can we cope with the question about translation? Should we after the interview, should we translate them into English and then analyze them, or just analyze the finding after the analysis?
So the reality is that it's best to analyze in the language of the interview. You want to preserve preserve that the meaning that's conveyed in that original language. However, the pragmatic reality is the fact that you may have or you will have a supervisory committee that does not understand Chinese, so they have to review your work. And so for them to review your work, you may have to translate some of your interviews, maybe 1 or 2 of your interviews, maybe some of your analysis. You may have to translate for them to be able to check your work. But in terms of the analysis itself, I would do the analysis in Chinese, and I would only report in English what you're going to report in your study.
Actually, you see, you know that sometimes we need to put some passage in our thesis, and
yeah, you translate that. Just translate that.
Only translate the part that we need to put into our paper, right?
Yes, unless, like I said. Sorry, go ahead.
Or should we translate all of the material?
Like I said, you don't have to, but you may need to show your data to your, for example, your supervisors or whatever. So in that sense, in that case, it's probably best just to translate it all. But my point is that when you do your analysis, do the analysis in the original language. The translation is only to show supervisory committee or show in your reporting, you know, because you have to present it in English. That's the only reason you translate. The analysis itself should be done in the original language.
So is this acceptable to after the let me see, is it acceptable to translate them directly after the interview?
You can translate whenever you want. You can do translation whenever you want. What I'm talking about is doing the analysis, because when you translate, you lose meaning. It's called lost in translation. You don't want to lose meaning. In other words, if I convey to you in a language, if I say something to you in Chinese, you should analyze it in Chinese, because you don't want to lose the meaning, the context of the language. Okay, translation is just a pragmatic necessity. You have to translate so that you can report. You have to translate so your supervisors can read your interviews and stuff like that. But the actual analysis work, keep it in that original language. So if you want to translate after the interview, translate. Go ahead. It's okay. You can translate.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Yeah. Okay, sure.
Prof.
Yeah.
Maizura here, Prof.
Yeah.
I just want to ask, what is the difference just now from Chai and Christian? I just want to ask, what is the difference of semi-structured approach interview, in-depth interview, and qualitative interview?
Jargon. It's just jargon. It's all the same thing. So usually we refer to qualitative interviews as qualitative in-depth interviews. So sometimes they're called qualitative interviews, sometimes they're called in-depth interviews. Usually they're called one-on-one, in-depth one-on-one interviews. It's all the same thing.
Because Prof,
I've
read somewhere.
Chai Ang is talking about the interview guide. That's different. Interview guide is what we just talked about in the article. The interview guide, you can have unstructured, semi-structured, or structured. So like a highly structured interview almost looks like a survey, where you have a lot of questions. Usually the answers are shorter. Okay, so usually you see that like in content analysis type of studies, where they're not that in depth. You know, they're still qualitative, but they're not that in depth really. But for in-depth interviews, it's either going to be semi-structured or unstructured interview guide.
But Prof, I've read somewhere, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong or my understanding is not that good. It says that this research uses semi-structured approach, not in-depth interview in that statement. So I thought, is there any difference?
I don't know what that means. I've never heard of such a thing. Semi-structured approach refers to the interview guide. And then the interviews are not referred to as semi-structured.
No problem. A semi-structured interview. It says
that means that's an in-depth
interview.
No, that means an in-depth interview using a semi-structured interview guide. That's what that means.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So it's
but
a matter of terminology.
It's not a very good way of writing it. It's not a very clear way of writing it, because they're two different things. Semi-structured is the way the interview is organized, the way you ask the questions, right? And the type of interview, the type of interview itself is an in-depth interview.
All right.
The interview guide is what is semi-structured.
All right.
So they're
There's no
just
such thing
cutting
as-
corners. They're just trying to economize on language is what they're doing.
So there's no such thing as semi-structured interview.
No, I
It's
mean,
only a guide.
well, no, they may call it that, but what they mean is the questions themselves are semi-structured. In
All
other words,
right,
the
okay,
structure of the interview is semi-structured. You know, the
All
way
right.
they ask the questions, but the interview itself is not semi-structured.
All
It doesn't
right.
make any sense. A semi-structured interview, it doesn't make sense. You can't have a semi-structured interview, really.
Okay, Prof, thank you.
Sure.
That's clear me now.
No, it's a big problem in qualitative research. All the use of terminologies can be very confusing. So don't be shy to ask. It's important that you get clarity, you know, on what you're reading.
Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, Wafi.
Assalamualaikum.
Walaikum salam. How are you, Wafi?
I have one question.
Yeah.
Let's say I have 4 people that I just interviewed. One people I observe him. The question is the person who was observed included in the respondent category, Prof?
I don't understand. You only interviewed one person. Why just one person?
Four people interviewed, one people observation.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Why did you only observe one person?
Just
It
wonder.
means 5 people together.
Sorry?
Mr. Rafi, it means 5 people together.
No, it's just 4 people.
4 people only.
Actually, I have nine people I just interviewed.
9 respondents.
One youth,
Okay.
one people I just observe their life, their parents. Just the one person that I just observed included in the respondent or not? It's my.
Well, yeah, again, I don't understand why you would only observe one person. I don't get that part. Is this for triangulation purposes, or what is your intention by observing just one person?
Aspect of triangulation, Prof.
Okay, but how can you triangulate with just one person?
Maybe triangulate of the method, interview, observe, and one aspect on document rating.
Okay, but observation cannot just be with one person. You have to observe several. I mean, you have to do, again, you have to do observation until you reach saturation. Saturation is achieved not individually by method. In other words, you don't achieve interview saturation and observation saturation. You achieve saturation of your entire data set. So you're integrating your interview data, your observational data, document analysis data to achieve saturation of the findings. So there's only one saturation point, which incorporates all 3 types of data, right? So you can't just say, I'm going to observe one person. You have to keep observing until you've reached saturation.
Okay, bro.
So you need to, no, the way you do triangulation is it has to be planned out. So I'm going to first do interviews, and then I'm going to follow up with observation. What am I going to look for in my observation? What is the purpose of the observation, right? It's not just like, oh, I'll just do an observation here or there, and, you know, just because it's called triangulation, I'm supposed to do it, you know. There has to be a real purpose behind it, and a structure, at least a plan on how you're going to use observation along with interviews, right? So maybe they're answering different research questions. You know, one research question is about the internal, you know, people's experience. The second research question is about their behavior, and that's where observation comes in. So for that research question, yeah, of course, saturation is only going to be based on observation because it's just based on observed behavior. Whereas the first research question is based on their internal interpretation of their experience. That's going to be based on interview. So, I mean, it has to be planned out along with the research questions, you know, so I can tell by your question, though, you don't really seem to have a clear plan as to how you're using these different approaches. So you need to be clear. You need to be clear about why am I doing observation? Why am I doing document analysis? What is the purpose behind it, and so forth. Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. Any other questions? Comments?
Hello, Prof. Yeah, I have a question about also about translation.
Oh, translation.
Is there any number limitation for language checkers? Yeah.
Is there a what limitation? Sorry.
Hello, Prof. Can you hear me?
Can you repeat the question?
Number limitation. Okay. Is there number limitation for language checkers? Yeah.
Numbers.
I mean.
Oh, how many people have to check it?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, I see. As long as you get one, as long as you have one qualified person, that's enough. But there has to be some indication that they're really qualified to check the language, you know. So maybe they're an English language lecturer, or they're a professional translator, or a native speaker or something. You know, there has to be some kind of criteria or qualification for them to be you know, a language checker. It's a new term, language checker, to check the translation. There are some people that are very strict on this. There are some that are very strict. Some will say, you know, you need 3 people to check it and stuff. I think that's excessive. I don't think you need that, but you definitely need somebody with some kind of qualification.
Okay. Sorry, Prof. Maybe the unstable internet. I didn't get your point.
Okay, so as long as you have
yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's okay now. Yeah.
Okay. As long as you have one.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a delay, I think. As long as you have one qualified person.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Chiang, for. If you check the chat box, the chat box has a clarification there. So there must be some qualification. So as long as you can show that they have a qualification of some kind. If you want, of course, if you want to use more than one, it's always better. It's always better if you have more than one. But as long as you have one qualified person, that's enough.
If the 2 persons are not qualified checkers, is that okay?
No, I mean, because you know, it doesn't matter how many if they don't understand English, it doesn't matter how many people you have that's checking it, right? So the number, that's why I said the number is less important than the quality of the person doing it.
Oh, yes, I see. Okay.
Okay. So yeah, just find somebody that, you know, a good, like like I said, an English language teacher or an English language lecturer, or you know, a well-educated native speaker, or some, you know, there has to be some kind of evidence of qualification.
Okay, I see. Thanks, Prof.
Okay, sure. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Maizura again.
I'm sorry, Prof. Just now you were talking about this translator for triangular. Is it acceptable because the translator is only doing translation for the language? They are not looking at the analysis. They are not looking at the method or concept or any transcription. So can we consider that as triangulation?
No. This is just translation. This is nothing. This has nothing to do with data analysis. This is for people doing interviews in one language and then reporting in another language.
Okay, but we can consider that as a triangular as well.
No, that's not triangulation. Triangulation is about data analysis. Triangulation is about data analysis. So triangulation is about using different types of data, different methods to try and triangulate your findings. So this has nothing to do
Okay,
with
Prof.
translation.
Okay.
Yeah. Two different topics.
Yes, Prof.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, there is a big debate, I mean, regarding the validity and credibility of what we call that, to check the validity of the interview guide. It's I mean, related to quantitative, especially for the surveys and the questionnaires. Do we need, is it necessarily to have what we call that, to check the validity of the interview guide? As we know that we in qualitative, there is, I think there is no, I mean, apply the validity and ability for the interview guide. Could you please elaborate on that, Prof?
No. Again, this is the influence of the quantitative sciences on qualitative research. So no, there's no such thing. I mean, you know, they talk about it now, but it's silly because it's, again, it's not a survey instrument. So there's nothing to validate. There's nothing to, you know, the only validation is the validity that you're getting, that the interview guide is able to generate data relevant to your research questions. That's the only validity related to an interview guide. That's the only purpose of the interview guide. So what I think what you're talking about is inter-rater reliability. Is that what you're referring to, Adnan?
Prof?
You're referring to inter-rater reliability? Is that what you're referring to?
No. I'm not just inquiring because this, what I read once I encountered one article said that when you want to do the validity, minimally you need to check, for example, the formation of the questions as well. I mean, you are not going to go into, yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, of course you can have people, you should have other people look at your interview guide. So in your case, your PhD students, so your supervisory committee should help you to look at your interview guide to make sure the questions are worded well, they're structured well, that they're covering, you know, the coverage is complete in terms of the topic. So yeah, sure, but that's not validating it. That's just verifying the quality of it, or it's not, there's no validity test per se to do that.
Yes, you are true, Prof.
So by absolutely, you should have your interview guide reviewed. There's no question. And in fact, one of the ways you can do it is you can give it to somebody else and have them ask you the questions and you try and answer the questions. In fact, I have an article, I usually give the students this article, and that's another technique that's used. So since you know the study topic well, you're supposed to anyway, if you are asked to answer those questions, you know, how do you answer those questions? How well can you answer those questions? And is the data that the questions are generating, is it relevant data? So that's why pilot interviews or preliminary interviews are very important. They're a very important part of the process. Okay, so whether you want to call it a pilot test or not, it's up to you. Again, that's just language. Whether you want to use your pilot respondents if you want to use the data in the actual study, that's also up to you. You can keep it separate. You can include the data. It's really up to you. Qualitative research, there's no firm conventions on these things, so it's not like in quantitative. But you definitely should need to do preliminary interviews to make sure that your interview guide is well constructed. Okay, so that's important.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question.
Assalamu alaikum, Prof.
Salam.
Yeah, I have a question also regarding the interview.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
I can.
Yeah, based on the discussion or the previous discussion regarding the interview, that we can do the preliminary interview first, then the real one, and then there is a follow-up interview. Yeah, am I right or not?
Not that you're not right. I'm just not sure what you're referring to when you say the follow-up interview. So
I mean, yeah, follow-up here. My question is regarding the follow-up. For example, here, if I want to conduct an interview, and this interview in order, for example, to collect some information. Actually, regarding to my study here, I want to collect some components regarding to developing a module. Okay.
Okay.
Then here, after collecting this module from the experts, or I need to analyze these components or to choose. So can I ask the same interviewee to help me to choose the best components so I can go back again to them? Or there's another procedures I can follow?
I'm not sure I'm following you.
Okay, let me do it in another way. First of all, we will have an interview or semi-structured interview, okay?
Right.
Based, I'm going to interview some experts.
Okay.
Then after, this interview or the questions will be based on help me to get components or some
Got it. I got it.
Yeah,
okay.
for the interview, for the module or making a module.
Right.
Okay, after collecting these components, I need to analyze these components. Maybe there are so many components and I need to sort out these components or to get the best one. Can I go back to them and ask them, to help me to sort out that? This is my question.
Absolutely. So the rule, it's not a formal rule, but the rule in qualitative research when it comes to follow-up, if you want to get confirmation of the findings that you already have, you go back to the same set of participants. If you want to further expand what you have, you interview new people. Okay?
Yes.
So for example, like what you just said, what I heard you just say is that you wanted to get confirmation that what you already sort of had arrived at, you wanted to get confirmation that you were sort of on the right track. Then, of course, that would be an indicator that you want to go back to the same participants. But if maybe at that point you were thinking, well, maybe you're not sure that your model is complete. Maybe there's some other stuff out there you're not sure. In that case, then you would probably go and interview somebody new to see if there's any additional information. Okay.
Yeah, because in this case, I need further information, so I cannot ask the same people. I got it.
Oh, I thought you wanted confirmation. Oh, it sounded to me like you wanted confirmation of what you already sort of came up with.
Yeah, this is what I want exactly, but I'm just confirming what you have said, that if I want extra information, I can get new people. But for confirmation, in my case, the same people, I can go back to them.
Right, right.
Yeah, got it. Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much.
Sure. Good question. Thanks.
Prof, we repeat the interview. So should we use the same interview protocol or just use the open-ended interview to get the additional information for the same informant before?
Well, no, if you're getting new information, obviously you must have new questions, right? Unless they didn't answer the question the first time and you want to go back, or you want to get clarification based on what they answered the first time, so you ask them again. But if there's new things that have come out of the data, there's new findings, and you want to find out what they think of these new findings, it's something new, obviously you're going to ask them new questions. You're not going to ask them the same questions.
Okay, bro.
Is that clear?
Thank you.
Is that clear?
Yes.
Yeah. So just remember, there's no rules to these things like you have in quantitative. It's really about how you judge the development of your finding and what you feel is needed at that time. So for example, if you feel like you're at a point where you want to do a sort of confirmation of what you have already, that's a form of member checking. Then you can go back to the initial pool of participants. But if you feel like you're not sure if you've reached saturation yet, you think maybe there could be some new other things out there that you haven't discovered yet, then go and find a new participant to see if you can extend what you already have. Okay, so you have to make these decisions as the researcher, but that's what qualitative research is all about. It's about your own sort of decision making and having the agency to make those choices at any particular time. That's why no two studies are the same in qualitative research, even if you're doing, so Chiang and I can be working on the same topic with the same participants, and we can arrive at different conclusions and make different decisions based on how each of us sees the data and the emerging finding, etc. Okay, that's why researcher as instrument is so critical to qualitative research. Okay, is that clear to everyone? I hope.
Doctor,
yes.
Is there any certain number for the interviewee, or it depends on your study?
It depends on in most studies, it depends on when you've reached saturation point. Yeah, so there's no fixed number, no.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Are there any questions in the Razia asked, so the sample can grow, or if saturation is achieved sooner than expected, the sample size can be reduced. Razia, what do you mean it can be reduced? Meaning you're gonna cut your sample down from what it was?
Yes, something like that. Means if you plan to interview for 10, and then if the saturation and achieved, then you can stop at sample number 7, something like that. Can?
Well, yeah, I mean, the idea is that you don't really have a plan. I mean, you may start off with a rough idea of how many, 10 to 15, 5 to 10, it depends depending on the type of the study, but you don't really have a concrete number in mind per se. So, and then the other thing is that it's always good to oversample. Like even if you've had 8 interviews and you think you've reached saturation, but you're not totally sure, right? It's always good to do another one just to be sure, because it's a lot easier to convince, your examiners that way than saying, well, I think I reached saturation, but I don't really have the evidence to show it.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Okay.
So better to be safe than sorry. Do the extra interview, right? That's what I would suggest. But
all right.
I've never read in a qualitative study of cutting down your sample. That's all. So, and don't ever say you reach saturation after like 2 or 3 interviews, because it's impossible. You cannot reach saturation. If that's the case, that means your interview guide is not complete, or your interviewing is not complete, and you have a very superficial finding, right? And remember, this is supposed to be an in-depth type of study, but if you're not presenting anything of any depth or any quality, then you can't say you reach saturation. But there are some people that say, after 2 interviews, they reach saturation. If I ask 2 questions, I can saturate very quickly, so you have to, it has to be balanced with coverage. That's why coverage is important. That's why the whole point about developing the interview guide according to those steps is very important, because, for example, you need to do a thorough literature review to do a good interview guide. If you don't, you may be missing out on important content. And if you're missing that content, then yeah, you can saturate very quickly. If I'm only covering one topic with 2 questions, hey, I can saturate after 15 minutes. I mean, it's not hard. But if you're really doing a proper in-depth study with the right amount of coverage at a level that can be considered PhD level, then no, you're not going to be able to saturate after 2 or 3 interviews. There's no way. Okay, so it has to be sort of balanced. It has to be in line with the scope of the study, right? That's why study scope is so important. And having a good theoretical framework to start with, a good literature review to show that you've covered all the topics in the literature, related topics in the literature. All right, so all those things are important, and they're interrelated. Okay, so that's all interrelated. And I think that article on the interview guide shows how that literature review is intimately related to the interview guide. Interview guide is intimately related to the interview. The interview is intimately related to saturation point. They're all interrelated. So if you don't do one properly, then the others are going to be affected. Okay, so it's a very systematic. It's actually more systematic than it looks.
can we involve different level or quality people for the interview? I mean, like heterogeneous, we can say experts.
No, so you should have, you should identify your criteria. What is the criteria that you're using to choose your sample? All right.
Yeah,
So
I want like different criteria. Maybe for example here I need some people who are expert in particular aspect, and others who are expert in practical part, like some people for practical and some people for theoretical part. Can I mix them together? Yeah.
If you find that they're both really important to what you're trying to develop, this module you're trying to develop, then absolutely. You just need to indicate that in your method section, that was part of your criteria.
Okay.
Yeah, and you explain why. What is the rationale for that? So yeah, it's really, again, that's up to you as the researcher to make that kind of decision. But you certainly can. But what I would not do, Rahma, I would not do, if you're going to do focus groups, I would not mix those people in the same focus group.
Not focus group.
Yeah, well, if you choose to do a focus group, so that's one of the sort of underlying rules of focus groups, is that you try to keep them homogeneous.
Yeah.
Because you don't want theory people and practical people in the same focus group. They might be, you know, they might be. It might be a very difficult focus group to have because of the different perspectives.
Yes, it might be conflict also. Yeah, between.
And yeah, it could end up being conflictual.
Yeah, thank you, Prof.
But for interviews, it's not an issue. Yeah, as long as you can justify why both are involved.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? So I don't think we're going to have time to do the interview tonight. So we will do that. We'll save that for next week because it's already almost 8:45. So Masni and Shahira, you guys are off the hook for tonight. But we will do it. We'll do it next week. First, we'll make sure we do it next week. We'll make sure we have time next week. So,
okay, no problem.
Right. Okay, so are there any last questions before we call it a week?
Prof. Shahida here. Can I ask a question?
Of course. Go ahead.
Because we are running out of time.
No, we have time for questions.
Always try. Maybe two questions, Prof. I suddenly remember about, is it the same? I mean, the term of field notes and diary, are they the same?
Okay, that's the question number one.
Then, yeah, the second question is data triangulation. If I were to interview someone from the managerial position and also just the lower position staff, is that considered as data triangulation?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
And then since I asked about the field notes, is that considered also as triangulation when you have your own field notes and also conducting semi-structured interview?
So your field notes include what? Field notes of what?
The things that I observed when they were doing interviews.
No. So see, this is a misconception. This idea that you observe people during interviews is observation. That's actually not what observation is. Observing people's behavior during an interview is just part of interviewing. So like when you interview somebody, you're also aware of body language. You're aware of maybe they have certain responses to certain types of questions, you know. All of that is part and parcel of doing good interviews. Okay, so that's not observation. Observation is a separate method that is conducted independently, where you're doing field work, you're observing people in whatever natural setting they're involved in, and you're going back repeatedly and actually documenting their actions, their behaviors, and so forth. That's observation. Okay, so yeah, this idea of observing people in an interview is not observation. I don't know where people get that idea from.
Okay. What about the diary? Is that the two different things?
So
Diary
yeah,
and the field note?
yeah, they should. So everybody should have a researcher's diary or a researcher's logbook. And like I mentioned,
Yes.
that's where you're sort of documenting, that's where you're keeping track of your well, both the procedures of the study, in other words, what you're doing, you're sort of documenting everything you're doing. So it's just sort of like a running list of like a laundry list almost. Like today I did interviews with so-and-so, the interview occurred here. You know, it's just sort of a list of facts about what you've done in the study. But then there's also the more the interpretive or reflective notes, which go along with that. And that's also part of the diary, okay, or the logbook. So those should both be in your researcher's diary or logbook. Field notes are something totally different. Field notes are analysis, they're data. You know, so you have a separate field, like you call it a field notebook, and then you have your researcher's logbook. They're two different things.
Okay, thank you, Prof.
Yeah, because your field note, the field notes are, like I said, they're data of what you're observing. The other one is just sort of your own. It's your own diary. It's your researcher's diary. It's a reflective tool. It's not data per se.
Can I
It's the
understand?
same as the reflexive memo, is it? Would the diary be considered a reflexive memo? Or
Yeah,
is
you
this
could do your
jargon again?
you could do your memoing. Yep, you include your memos in there too. You can do reflective memos. You can do analytical memos. You know, and sometimes, like an analytical memo is like if you've ever used in vivo, you know, you come across this point where you're analyzing your data, and then something just sort of a light bulb goes off, and you make a connection, and you say, you know what, I just think I found a new category. But you need to work through that. How do you know there's a category there? And so you need to actually write it out. Well, this code relates to this code, and this is how it relates. And then you can even bring in literature to that to say, so and so connect, you know, said this, and so you're making these connections. That's an analytical memo. And sometimes analytical memos can even be turned into journal articles. I've seen that actually happen, because they can get very in depth, especially if you've like discovered it, you know, the way you've come across a new major theme, for example. And you show all those linkages there. You have to work that out. Like you may see it in your head initially, but then you need to actually work it out. How does it all relate? How does it all connect? And to do that, you really need to write it out. And that's what an analytical memo is. And they're really important to do. And we don't really, I know a lot of people don't do them, and it's a shame, because when they're questioned about later in their, you know, in their defense or viva or whatever, and they're questioned about this theme that they've come up with, and how do you know if these things are connected or related, or what's the evidence for that? And they can't really answer because they haven't really worked through it enough. You know, they sort of see something there, they see a kind of connection, but they haven't really worked through, how does this connection occur? You know, what is the connection there? So that's the analytical memo. But you can also do a reflective, reflective memoing is the journal or the logbook. That's where you do all your reflective memoing. Yeah. So it's a really important part of the process, but I think a lot of people, they just sort of skip it because it takes time, and it's, you know, it can be a bit time consuming. But I think it's really helpful to work through these things through writing. You know, when you know, reflection is really, when you write out your reflections, they're really, really, they can be really powerful, because a lot of times we think we understand things in our heads, but until we actually write it out, we can see that we don't really understand. And if you, once you start, like in academia, of course, we do a lot of writing, journal articles, perfect example. We may have a really good idea for an article, but then once we start writing it, we really know whether it's a good idea or not, because sometimes it sounds good in your head, but when you go to write it, you're like, well, wait a minute, I don't really understand this as much as I thought I did, because I can't write it out. I just cannot articulate it. You know, so the ability to write is really where everything gels when you start to write it out. Otherwise, it's just an idea in your head, and it's sort of not clear, and it's, you know. So it's a good practice to get in the habit of writing as much as you can during your study. And it'll help you later when you go to write up your chapter 4, your chapter 5. It'll help you immensely. If you're just writing for the first time when you go into chapter 4, oh my God, it'll be overwhelming. It'll be overwhelming. right? But if you're documenting as you go, you're reflecting as you go, you know, you're really doing good analysis by writing everything out, making those connections. When you write your chapter 4, it'll be much easier. It'll be much easier. So I would just, yeah, recommend start writing early. And you cannot overwrite in a qualitative study. There's no way you can overwrite. You cannot write too much. Okay, so whatever thought you have, whatever idea you have, questions you have, very important. You know, so your journal is where all your important questions should go in. You know, we know you have a bad day. You've done analysis and you haven't gotten anywhere. You've had a bad day. You know, write those frustrations. Write the questions you have. Write what's confusing you. You know, it's really helpful. That whole process is really helpful. So that's writing. But yeah, thank you for the question, Shahida. Good questions. And Chai Eng also.
Prof.
Yeah, Hanizan.
Yeah, you were saying just now that asking examples during interview does really help us to writing in chapter 4. Can you please elaborate more on that?
So in those practice interviews that I have on the Puja Blast for your assignment 3, if you look at the there's 2 interviews. One is done really poorly purposely to show you what a bad interview looks like, and then one is done really well. Okay, so in that second one, she gives really good examples of how you use examples in an interview. So for example, you ask a question and the participant gives you a response it's a response like, oh, how did you find the training program? Oh, it was pretty good. You know, I kind of enjoyed it. You know, there were some good moments there. I felt I learned a lot. Okay. Like that kind of an answer is, you know, if we're not really well versed in qualitative research, we might say, okay, it sounds like they had a positive experience in the training. Okay. But that doesn't really tell us much. It doesn't really tell us much at all. If they say, oh, I had a really good experience, that would be a real indicator to follow up with something like, tell me what was good about it. You know, can you give me an example of a moment in the training that you felt was really good? What happened during that moment? Right? So you're asking them to really give you an example. So it's not just like, oh, it was a good training program. Oh, okay, participant felt it was a good training program. That doesn't tell us anything. What does good mean? What was good about it? You know, good could mean that it was, you know, it was fast because they didn't want to be there. So it was good that they got to leave early. You know, but that doesn't tell us about the quality of the training. So you need to probe, you need to ask them. And the best way to ask them is to give you concrete examples. Can you give me an example of what was good about it? Right? Can you give me an example of, you know, something that you learned during the training program, a specific skill that you learned? You know, then you'll see whether they really feel it was good, because that forces them to really come up with something real, something concrete. Okay, so it's always good to ask for lots of examples and to get clarity on these kind of answers that people give you. Does that answer your question, Hanizan?
Yes, thank you very much. I can relate now in terms of how can I, you know, use all those examples when writing in chapter 4 now.
Yeah, in fact, that's the best type of data to illustrate your findings, actually. You know, because it's the clearest evidence. It's the most, you know, there's no ambiguity. There's no, well, what do they really mean by that? That could mean a million things, you know. No, if they say, oh, I learned how to communicate, you know, I learned how to speak in public, you know, it's very clear. There's no ambiguity there. But if they say, oh, yeah, I learned a lot of skills in the training program. Okay, well, that could mean anything, right? Maybe you learned the skill of how to sleep. I mean, you know, what does that mean? You know, so get an
example is actually put a meaning into a statement. Am I correct, Paul?
Sorry, can you
examples
say
given by the examples given by the participant is actually give a meaning to the statement given by the participant.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And it's sometimes this is a little bit difficult for especially for novice researchers, because maybe you feel like you're being nosy or you're kachawing them, you know, by asking them all these details and stuff, you know, and in some ways you are, but that's your job. I mean, that's the job of a researcher. So you have to kind of be like that. And so maybe before the interview, you can just sort of warn them, you're going to be asking them lots of questions about what they did and all that stuff. So prepare them as best you can, but you do have to kind of catch them a bit. It is a little bit like that.
But I find that I have had experiences whereby that, you know, in the process of interviewing, the participant gets so excited that they start talking about other things, then they go and veer off course, and I don't know how to bring them back to the main.
That's a common problem.
Topic.
Everybody has that. Everybody has that experience. It's just human behavior, human nature. So I always I give people leeway when it comes to those things, you know, let them talk, it's fine. Especially in the beginning when you're just getting to know them, you don't want to cut them off and be rude and stuff like that. So just give them some leeway. And remember the first interview, you know, I mean, don't expect a lot from the first interview. Go in the first interview with low expectations. You know, if you can just come out of the interview with some good basic foundational information, you've built rapport with them, you know, you got on well with them, they seem to trust you, right? I mean, that's a good first interview. If you need to follow up for more detail, just make sure that at the end of the interview you mention to them that, you know, you may be contacting them again for follow-up. Is it okay? You know, and say, oh yeah, sure, no problem, you know. So at least you've left that door open. But really, I mean, don't put these huge expectations on yourself. Like you get all the answers from the first interview. You may not, you know, you may have a very good interview, but like Chiang said, you may have someone that just likes to talk a lot and they're just talking about everything under the sun. And you need to learn how to be diplomatic, you know. Oh, that's a great story. Maybe could you just tell me how that related to my initial question? I sort of lost the, you know, you sort of have to kind of be diplomatic, you know, like, sorry, I didn't quite get you. I didn't really quite get what you meant there, or, you know, try and bring them back somehow, you know. It is a skill. Interviewing is a skill. You have to sort of learn it, and it's a lot of diplomacy and, you know, that kind of thing. But the best way is just practice. The more you do, the more comfortable you get. So I found when I was starting out, my biggest problem was not listening really attentively because I'm thinking about the next question I want to ask. You know, okay, so after this question, what am I going to ask next? You know, and I'm not really listening to the person respond because I'm thinking about what question I'm going to ask next. And that's completely self-defeating because you're missing the whole interview, right? And so, and by doing that, you're risking asking a second question that's not even related to the first question. So you really have to try your best not to do that, even though it's gonna, you know, it's, again, human nature, you're gonna probably do that. Try to control, just try to focus on listening. And then when they're done, or when you feel like, you know, they've answered, then just look at your sheet and say, okay, what's next? You know, there's no pressure. There's no pressure. You know, take it slow. But the most important thing is to really listen to what they're saying, you know, and then, because by doing that, you'll know whether to ask a probing question, a follow-up question. You know, you'll listen to see, oh, wait a minute, they said something there that was not quite sure what they meant. Maybe I need to follow up on that, you know. So listening is the most important thing. Active listening.
Yes, Prof. I have a question, please.
Yeah, Adnan.
If I am intending to interview some students, I mean, high school students, not, I mean, children in the school.
Okay.
Do I need to have prior parents' consents? I mean, regarding interviewing the students?
Which country are you doing this in?
In Oman, in my country.
You have to find out what are the laws and the rules in your country on that, because it depends on the country. Some countries require parental consent if they're under 18. But it depends on the country, so you need to find out. However, that said, the UPM Ethics Committee will most likely require you to get consent anyway, because that's the university's rules.
Okay, so this is what I'm asking about. I mean,
yeah. So there's two things. The first, of course, is the media one is the university. So go and check the JKE guidelines on that and see what they think. And I'm almost positive it's, if they're under 18, you need to get consent. And then also if there's additional, I don't know, there may be additional requirements in your country. I don't know. We need to find out about that.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you.
Yep, sure.
Prof, Shahida here again.
Yeah.
Do we need the approval from the ethics board of VPM for pilot interview?
Technically, yes. Technically, yes. Although, if you want to just go out and do an informal interview, you know, I mean, you know, do it, just do it. Don't call it an interview.
I will do it.
You don't have to call it an interview. Like, I mean, preliminary interviews don't have to be formal. They can just be informal. Like, if you're just trying to find out whether you're, you know, you're asking the right research questions, even, you know, just go and talk to somebody informally. It doesn't have to be a formal interview. For that kind of thing, I don't think you need any kind of ethics approval. But if you're gonna do a formal sit-down interview, protocol, you know, all that, yeah, you're supposed to get ethics approval. That's why it's best to do the ethics as soon as possible. You know, so once the proposal's finished, immediately send off for ethics approval. Once that's done, you can start.
Okay, I understand. Thank you, Prof.
Yep. All right. Well, I think it's time. It's 9 o'clock, so we will adjourn for the week. I apologize for not getting to the interview, but it's always, to me, it's always more important that I try my best to answer your questions and, you know, address your concerns, because this class is really meant to be a troubleshooting support group. It was initially created for students that were in the field, actually, to come back with their issues and their problems and their difficulties to discuss and work through them and stuff like that. So I'll always give precedence to students' questions and, you know, your real life concerns, you know, even though I have things planned for the class, but inshallah, we'll get to all those things as well. So, okay, so just like in qualitative research, we have to be flexible in this class. Okay, so I'm training you to be a flexible qualitative researcher by not sticking to the agenda every week. Okay, that's my excuse. All right, so have a good week, everyone. Inshallah, we'll see you next week.
Thank you very
so
much,
much,
Prof.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you, Prof.
Okay.
Thank you,
Prof.
Thank you,
All right.
Prof.
Thank you,
Bye.
Doctor.
Thank you, Prof.
Okay.
Thank you, Prof.
Good
night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Yeah, good
Oh,
night.
good night.
Good night.
Bye.